Well, welcome to episode Sweet 16 of Soul Care with Stevie Boy. I always feel a sense of honor if even one person tunes in. And so if you're the one, I'm honored by you tuning in. And my prayer, my hope is that as we look into this book of Philippians, a book of hope, and a book that helps us to frame reality. I just hope that you're encouraged and provoked, and that your heart and your mind are turned to God's design. So, we last episode we looked at the closing remarks of Paul in chapter 1. And by the way, again, remember, Paul didn't write in verses and chapters. He just wrote a letter. And the truth is, he didn't write it, he dictated it. But hear what we have as chapter 1 in the end. Beginning in verse 27, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you were going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. I want to talk a little bit today about a subject none of us really very much wants to talk about. Subject of suffering. We don't know very much about suffering in America. We know a lot these days about inconvenience, and yes, there are thousands and thousands of families that know about suffering because they or a loved one is suffering or has been suffering, and perhaps even a loved one has died because of the coronavirus. Yeah, we do know about that kind of emotional suffering. We know very little about the kind of physical suffering that Paul and these first century believers in Philippi knew and experienced. I could easily make too much of this whole thing. And oh, by the way, we're not horrible people because we don't know about suffering. We are not second-class citizens because we're not suffering as a result of our faith. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think one of the things that Paul is pointing to here is something that because we don't have it in our normal experience, we probably will need to pause and look at it and think deeply about it. When he says, this is in verse 29, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. That's very, I think, a very neglected concept for American Christians. And the truth is, for most of us in the Christianized world, if I can use that term, not only has it been granted. You see, I think that points to the idea that Paul believed that suffering for the sake of Christ was a privilege. Peter, the books of 1st and 2nd Peter are so neglected by the church in America, I believe. And part of the reason I think that these two books are neglected is because they deal in pretty strong detail with this idea of suffering. And Peter says, if you suffer for doing bad, well, that's just reaping what you sow, is my paraphrase of what he said. But if you suffer for following God's will, for following God's ways, then that's honorable. Paul, I think, is saying something very similar to that right here. Yes, it is a privilege. We have been given this privilege to believe, and it's also a privilege to suffer for the sake of Christ. It's not a privilege to suffer because of a stupid choice. That's not what Paul is saying. I think I said it last time. For being stupid, you get bad stuff. I don't know. I mean, that's just reaping and sowing. But when you suffer because of a choice you made to pursue God's will and God's design and what we know of His way, that's a privilege. It has been granted to you, not only to believe, but also to suffer. I have to reframe constantly in my own mind the significance of my experiences when I suffer. And the emotional suffering that I referred to, it is suffering. I will not minimize the depth of emotional suffering. I can't. In my own life, it's been too real. It's been too impactful for me to be able to just shrug it off and go, well, that's not suffering. Yes, it is. It's a different kind of suffering than the suffering that the persecuted church in the world today is experiencing. But don't think for a minute that the emotional suffering that many of you and us are experiencing is not suffering. My challenge is to frame your suffering as not a punishment, but as a privilege. Holy cow, you got to be kidding. That's just stupid. Well, not so much. When I didn't do anything to bring on this particular episode of suffering, if it's not the result, if I'm not reaping what I've sown, then really I think what I can say is there's two aspects of this, and I'm kind of in the deep end of the pool, but it's okay. First of all, Satan is the author of suffering. I believe that sin, when it entered the world through Adam and Eve, generated suffering, which was unknown until that time. But when sin entered the world, so did suffering, so did death. Well, much of the suffering that I experience is the result of bad choices. Okay, we've already established that. But there is the suffering that you and I experienced we had nothing to do with. We didn't cause it, we didn't promote it, this is not the reaping of what we've sown. It's perhaps the result of someone else's bad choice. Yeah. Or it is what God has permitted to come into our lives, and He uses it. It is His tool to shape us into the image of Christ. I wish He could do, and He could, but He doesn't seem to, in my life, He seems almost never to use something more pleasant to shape me. It's usually the suffering that does the most profound shaping in my life. And so on that level, this suffering that I experience, that you experience, is a profound privilege that God so desires for us to be shaped to, in Paul's words in Romans chapter 8, chapter 12, that we would be conformed to the image of His Son. That's so deeply His desire that He permits, and I suppose maybe causes, suffering to come into our lives in order to shape us, to conform us, so that we will be more like Jesus. So does that make suffering not hurt so much? No, it doesn't. Suffering is suffering. If it didn't hurt, it wouldn't be suffering, right? I think what it does, though, is it helps us gain perspective. And when I can believe that there's a purpose in my suffering, I can do more than endure the suffering. I can actually profit from the suffering. But if all I'm doing is just grinding my teeth and cursing the universe because of what's happening to me, there's little good that can come from that. Okay, that's my rant on suffering, and I think as Christians in America, it's probably a good thing for us to reframe and reconsider suffering. Now, on to, believe it or not, chapter 2. These are very encouraging words to me, and well, let's go. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort in his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. I am a trained human relations professional. I got a master's degree from the University of Oklahoma in human relations. I have thought often, we don't in the church often think about human relations. We think about divine relations, and that's absolutely right. We must. And yet I think sometimes we don't think deeply enough or often enough about the relationship between each other as the result of God's work in our lives. There is an aspect of human relations in this whole God relationship thing. I think if we could figure out how to integrate these few verses into the normal patterns of our lives as individuals and as groups, a very large majority, I think, of the human relations problems that we experience would go away. We're only going to get a few words into this before the time limit hits, but let's go into it. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, and this is a bit rhetorical, as though Paul were saying, you do have it. And so let's think about any encouragement from being united with Christ. Shouldn't there be a strong sense of encouragement from being united with Christ? For me, I've come to believe that the encouragement aspect of this is from the fact that Christ wanted us to be united with him. He chose us. He wasn't stuck with us. It's not like because I'm a short person. I'm just over the Zacchaeus line, but I'm still short. And I always have been. All the time in my growing up years in grade school, junior high, and high school, I was, one of the short kids. And so when we played basketball, the pickup game of basketball in Rodney Evans' driveway, he's a captain, then you choose. Well, I was very familiar with being chosen last. And in fact, sometimes I knew what it was like for them to go, no, you take him. Oh, no, you take him. Because I didn't have anything to offer. I didn't jump high. I didn't dribble well. I was not a great shooter. I'm not wired and built for being a good basketball player. I'm not Steph Curry. Well, sometimes I think we carry that view into what Christ thinks of us. Okay, I'm stuck with you, so yeah, okay, I'll take you. That was not it. The truth is He's not stuck with us. He wanted us. We're going to pursue that when we get together next time. But my challenge for you is two things. The application here is, first of all, go back to the suffering picture. I want you to think about the hard times that you have endured in this past year. And if it always helps me to write this kind of stuff down. If it doesn't help you, then don't worry about it. But think about the events and then think about what did you learn. The event on one side, what I learned on the other side. Okay? That'll help us reframe the suffering and the privilege of suffering because of the outcome. Second thing is, I want you to think about the encouragement of being in Christ. We're going to come back to it next week because it's a very deep and very broad subject. But for now, I have burned through 16 minutes and 10 seconds, and it's time for me to shut up and let you go. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.